by the way, which is sort of similar to what we typically have. So I'd like to get the first session underway, which will look at President Trump and how his policies will affect things that are relevant to our conference, offshore structures, financial regulations, tax laws. So if the speakers could come up, I'd appreciate it. And the Wi-Fi code, by the way, is Miami 2017. And the speakers are Jack Blum, who is very well known. I'm sure many of you already know him, of the Tax Justice Network, private sector attorney. Jeffrey Marcus of Marcus, Nyman and Rashbaum, and Art VANDESANDE, recently retired former criminal IRS agent, now has his own firm called Concorde Associates. So just take it away.
Good morning. Trying to explain President Trump is quite a chore. I was astonished when I turned on a television and saw that in interviews yesterday, he talked about our archaic system of government. And I thought, oh my God, that's exactly the point. And how he didn't know that is incredible to me. To make this point clear, I'd like to tell you a story. It's about the senator I first worked for when I came to work at the Senate, Philip Hart of Michigan, who was generally known as the conscience of the Senate. I had left the antitrust subcommittee, which he chaired, and learned that he was retiring and that he had been diagnosed with cancer, and this was going to really be a last farewell. And I made an appointment to see him. Well, the place where we had to meet was off the Senate chamber, and he was sitting talking to a journalist. And I sort of heard the last part of his conversation with the journalist before I could talk to him. And the conversation went something like this. Well, Senator, you've been here 18 years, and you don't seem to have gotten very far in accomplishing the things that you set out to do. Hart was a liberal. He had a lot of ideas that he put on the table, and needless to say, he didn't have enough votes to get very many of them through. So Hart said, look, you don't understand this system. This system is designed so that nobody can ride into Washington on a white horse and announce what he's going to do and how it's going to work. In fact, it's designed to break people who ride into Washington on a white horse and think they can tell everybody what to do and that it'll happen. It's a city that insists that you listen to the different parts of the country and the different ideas, and everything here is a result of a compromise. Then he went on to say the function of a politician is to make compromises that everybody can live with, and that's very important because having everybody more or less agree on the rules of the road is what keeps a nation together and keeps it functioning. And my hope is that somewhere along the line, President Trump figures all of this out, but he's off to a really terrible start at it. The question is really this. What can President Trump do simply by himself to change very important and basic policies? And I would argue not a whole hell of a lot, because most of the changes are issues that require legislation moving through Congress. As you know, Congress is pretty bitterly divided, and nobody seems to be working very hard at coming up with compromises. So I don't think there's going to be very much change in the basics. There's a lot of noise, but the noise so far hasn't led to much. And in the key areas, there are people coming into government who are discovering a number of things. One, we call our governments administrations, not regimes. And we use the word administration because the job of the government is to administer the laws. When Mnuchin became Secretary of Treasury, he had a set of laws that you might describe as a job description. And wherever he turns and in whatever direction he goes, he's bound by the laws that cover the office of the Secretary of Treasury. Also, there's a little problem called reality. So we talk about tax law, for example, and there the reality is that IRS's budget has been whacked so badly over time that its ability to function has, in part, been undermined. Well, Mnuchin figured out that there is a reason for having IRS agents at work, that for every dollar you spend on an IRS agent, you collect $6, maybe $7, and if they're working on high net worth audits, they're collecting as much as $16 a person. So cutting the budget adds to the deficit. And what he is and what the people at OMB are going to discover is they're conservatives who get mugged by reality. So the notion that you can just cut the budget willy-nilly and that that's going to somehow advance your cause is a little silly, because they still have to confront the idea of deficit and balancing the budget. And that's because, not because of technical reasons, but simply because the budget is constrained and there has to be reconciliation, and they're working under sequester. So this is all quite crazy. In the areas that I'm concerned about, I think enforcement of IRS offshore is going to improve, because IRS is now out from under the burden of preparing half the IRS management to testify on the Hill about nonprofit corporations. The other reason I think things at IRS will improve is that IRS itself has rearranged so that it focuses on going after people who have the money and where the possibilities of collection are. There was a time when every journalist I know who had a home office was in danger of being audited, and maybe that audit would produce $100 difference in tax. Somebody in management figured out this wasn't a good way to spend time. And in fact, now people understand where the real money is, and an awful lot of it is offshore. So I don't look for any change in that. I'd also say that not much change is coming in other areas. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have now gotten ourselves involved in a network of treaties and agreements that make changes in that act very difficult. And likewise, major fraud cases will still have prosecutors in each of the federal districts. All of them are going to be out there trying to make a name for themselves. And if there's a possibility of going after some really major international crime, I'll bet no matter what the Attorney General says, they'll do it. No question in my mind. So all in all, despite all the noise, despite all the bluster, despite all the insanity, I think we're looking at not a whole hell of a lot of change. I hope other people on the panel will have different views, but that's my take on where we are. Thank you.
There we go. Good morning. They gave us a mic, so we're going to sit down for the rest of the presentation. Our goal here is to give you different opinions on what we believe is going to happen in the administration. So besides my esteemed colleague, I have some different ideas on how things are going to be working out in the next couple of years. But I do agree that the administration is large. The U.S. government is not something that changes easily. As we say, it's a large B-52. It takes a long time to turn. It doesn't do anything quickly. Regarding FATCA, I do believe that the administration wants to repeal it. There's been a lot of talk about repealing it, but I don't think they have the votes or the ability to do it currently. What they do have the ability to do, like the previous 2 or 3 administrations, is just not enforce it. That's an easy thing to do in the administration because it just gives specific executive advice to prioritize. They don't have to say they're not going to do it legally. They just have to not put emphasis on it. And the previous 8 years, there's been many cases where that happened, where the administration said they did not like something, and they just didn't prioritize it. They wouldn't tell you it was illegal. They just wouldn't do it. So it's a very common thing in the executive branch to do something like that, and I think that's where FATCA is going to go with that. And remember, there's a whole, in the United States, there's a whole disagreement on the idea of producing your wealth information for the U.S. government. We've always been sort of renegade in that area. We're an income-based taxation. We have been since the 16th Amendment. And we appear to be wanting to stay that way. So anytime you ask a U.S. citizen for their wealth, tell me about your personal information, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback on that. So the whole idea of FATCA is to report your wealth as opposed to report the income that you earn from various jobs. So that's probably not going to go well. Regarding the administration, if you recall, when FATCA was passed, it was a party line vote. Not in disagreement or agreement of which party you are. The fact of the matter is it was a party line vote. And you can guarantee that in any government that if something is passed on a party line vote, when the next party gets in, they're going to go against what the other party did. So there was no Senate votes from the Republicans, and no House Republican members voted on FATCA approving it. So obviously they do not support it, and they're going to try their best to go around it. There's been a lot of discussion on the cost benefit of FATCA. We could discuss that for hours. There's been a lot of people that have supported data to show how much revenue has been produced. Not very well. Data hasn't been very good, and also there hasn't been a lot of discussion on the cost benefit as it applies to the firm itself, the people that are having to do the compliance training, do the checks, do the audits, and then also deal with the problems with FATCA as problems arise. So there's a lot of articles on that, but the cost benefit ratio has really not been proven. Also, the U.S. has not signed on to any of the reciprocity rules. I'll get into that on the common reporting system, but the executive branch has made many promises in these IGAs, the intergovernmental agreements with different countries, but they've done that without any legislative authority. The executive branch has some limit on what they can do, and they've done that without the legislative branch, and they've done that without obviously any support from treaties, if you wanted to make it more of a treaty document. So there has been some issues with the U.S. government providing reciprocity, and there's obviously a hypocrisy in that when we get to the common reporting system. Just recently in the Wall Street Journal, even the IRS tax advocate, Nina Olson, there was a small column in the Journal a few weeks ago where she was commenting on why we were putting so much effort into the FATCA effort. showing that there really wasn't a problem prior to that. The goal of the advocate is to give independent advice to the administration and the public, and her comments were basically, there wasn't much of an offshore problem with the U.S. before based on statistics, so why are we putting so much effort into the FATCA issue? Now, she's just one person out of many, but that was her comments. Also, the GOP, when they ran on their platform, the Republicans, they actually put it in their platform that they were going to try and repeal FATCA. So if you want to look it up on your computers right now, it's page 13, GOP platform 2016. So you have to assume that the incoming party is not going to be happy about something, especially if they put it in their platform. Also, just a few days ago on April 26th, there was a committee hearing where Senator Rand Paul testified in front of the House, a House committee, on putting forth a repeal bill on FATCA. And they were going to probably try and insert it into the next tax law that's coming out, possibly. But I don't think they have the votes for it, but they are discussing it. That's Representative Paul Meadows and Senator Rand Paul. So there is an effort based on the majority to at least try and put this in the bill. Whether or not they have the votes, as Jack said, the consensus is usually you don't get many things done, but that's their issue. As a follow-up on the common reporting system, the related issue of FATCA is the common reporting system that you all are familiar with, generally referred to as the GATCA, the worldwide FATCA. And it was gaining steam under the previous administration, but the U.S. Hasn't fully approved of the expanded CRS, as you all know. They're one of they are the only major grouping of countries that has not signed on to the advanced CRS. I forgot the exact terminology for it. So there is an issue with that because, as you know, especially those that live outside the U.S., the U.S. is getting what we want, and I'll say we as a former agent. The U.S. is getting to grab information because they're the big player on the market, and they're asking everybody else to send them information, and they're getting that done. But the U.S. doesn't want to sign on to the CRS reciprocity issue and put information available on an automatic exchange to go back out to the other countries. Whether you're for or against that, the U.S. hasn't signed on to that, and obviously there's a one-way treatment going on right now. And they can't, obviously if they try to do a treaty, they don't have the votes for that, and there are some constitutional issues if you read the articles regarding the common reporting system. There's a lot of, again, going back to the income tax versus wealth issue, a lot of Americans will file lawsuits complaining, and they've already started. I think the Crawford case is the first one. And they've already started complaining, why is the government basically searching my information without probable cause? So one of the things that we got from our fellow Brits, our cousins, is that we don't like to do anything unless a judge signs off on it and provides a warrant on why we should give you something, or why you should be in my house, or why you should be in my business. It's a common theme in the United States, and I don't think that's going to go away. So if CRS were to move forward, you would probably see a lot of lawsuits against it. But right now, we're not even providing the reciprocity of FATCA. So hypocritical position? Yes, obviously. So the next issue I think that's a change for the Trump administration is the administration of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. I do believe that they're going to maintain the majority of the law. They don't have the votes to repeal it. They don't probably have the votes to change it substantially, but again, they have the ability for prosecutorial discretion and on whether or not they want to enforce certain things. The previous administration was real strong on this. The statistics went through the roof on new cases, and especially on the fines associated with the new cases. So there's and again, going back to the previous rules, there's a huge cost benefit to comply with the FCPA rules. A huge cost benefit, especially for the overseas firms like Walmart and the very large companies. They do a lot of training, they spend a lot of money, and when the investigations start, they spend an enormous amount of money with local counsel and trying to work through the process. And then on top of that, they get fined at the end of the process. So it's a very tough road if you're a multinational company and you're under FCPA rules. to work through this. So there's probably going to be some form of cost-benefit analysis being done by the new administration to determine which cases are valid and also to make them less costly. There's some themes out there about whether or not you want to give companies a break based on if they did their training properly, if they have a compliance program, if they did quarterly training and their employees are all trained, and then you have one rogue employee that goes off and does something improperly, or 10 or 20 in a company of several thousand. Why should the whole company have to be fined with such a massive fine and the expense of going through the process? So there'll probably be some indicators on whether or not they're going to soften that portion of it, maybe modify how they fine people. Also, there was an issue with the non-prosecution agreements and deferred prosecution agreements, how they were kind of strong-arming the companies into complying, and then, of course, the fines were very, very massive. So there might be some discussions on whether or not we should allow more of these to go to trial and less deferred prosecution agreements. So I do see them pushing the large bribery cases. I see them, maybe the fines being adjusted and limiting some of the exposures of the companies. The next issue that might be in effect from the new administration is they just changed the reporting requirements for the FBAR, for the Foreign Bank and Financial Account Report, the annual one. The due date is now April 15th. That was started by the previous administration. So the April 15th deadline now coincides with the filing of your personal return. It's no longer in the middle of the year. My business partner that I work with, CPA Alex Martinez, and I had been discussing this for a long time, and he's been a big advocate of that getting pushed back to your personal return. So for a lot of the civil, the CPAs and accountants have to do the returns. This is a welcome change to get it in line with your personal tax return. It used to be on June 30th, so now it's April 15th. And going off Jack's comments on IRS, since that's my parent organization before I retired, this year, let me read you some stats. This is from the 2016 year. There were approximately 3,395 investigations initiated. That's across the entire United States, 3,395 initiated. Out of those, 573 were identity theft cases. That's 16%, almost 17% of the cases. Very juvenile, elementary type cases, not something that the government should be focusing on if they have limited resources, as my partner just said. 23% are narcotics cases, combination of return prepared cases, around 30%. Terrorism, 1.2% of IRS criminal investigation cases, 1.2%. Abusive tax schemes, which would involve more of the people in this room, which are the offshore, the large-scale cases, only 56 the last year, 1.6% also. And international cases, 221, 6.5%. So I believe, considering what the new secretary had said, the Secretary of the Treasury, that if you're going to go after things that are more efficient, I would suggest they get away from 1.2% terrorism cases and increase the abusive tax schemes cases from 1.6%. That should probably be up in the 30s and 40%. And obviously increase the international cases from 6.5%. And just so you know the path that they were on, for the last 4 or 5 years, IRS criminal investigation, which is the sole authority over tax evasion charges, just in 2013, they had 1,400 identity theft cases. This is something the previous administration, almost going back to President Bush, also got into, where they thought that identity theft was far more important than going after large-scale crime that produced far greater returns. So they do need to get back and do something better about selecting cases. But the agency, as Jack said, has been decimated. When I started 30 years ago there, we had 3,300 agents. Today they have 2,200 working agents. So over a 30-year period, they've dropped, not just from the previous administration, from several presidents, have decimated the IRS criminal investigation, 1/3 of their force. It's the only agency in the entire government that has been decimated by 1/3 of their special agents. So obviously they don't like the IRS. That's clear. So they have a wrong case selection right now. They need to emphasize, as Jack said, more on large dollar cases, large criminal cases. And I believe the Attorney General wants to focus on the public corruption cases. He's stated that such in interviews, and to increase the amount of cases in these priority areas. Obviously, you would think with terrorism on the rise that we would be spending more than 1.2% of our cases. Now, the FBI has primary responsibility over that, but if you want the money stopped, you'll come to the IRS to get that done. So, and just a few days ago, as everybody expected, although they thought that it wouldn't, the IRS chief will be stepping down. As all new administrations are, they're going to clean the house and put the people they want in. And so just 6 days ago, the IRS chief announced that he will be stepping aside. He's been there for 5 years. Most people thought he did a good job other than the case selection. And I believe the new person coming in with the Treasury Secretary will reemphasize their own priority. And those are the main areas under the Trump administration. But as Jack said, it's a big behemoth. It does not turn easily, and you shouldn't see too many drastic steps, especially coming from the financial side.
Thanks. Well, a lot can change in a year. This time last year, I was defending the Clinton Foundation and the Clintons in a federal lawsuit that was filed in South Florida, where Judicial Watch and some other groups were trying to get their private email server and private emails. And that case we were able to get dismissed for different reasons. We were feeling pretty good going into the summer, and then of course Jim Comey stole our thunder, and an election happened, and now we're sitting on a panel opining on what might happen in the future with President Trump's policies. My background, I was a federal prosecutor, and I focused on financial crimes, but I've been in been in private practice now for over 8-9 years since then, and I routinely defend companies and individuals in government investigations. So my focus on the panel today is sort of talking about enforcement and what might happen going forward with enforcement, given the fact that, certainly if we go back several years, we know that President Trump has made statements very critical of, for example, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and is certainly not a fan of regulation or government enforcement, as we've seen. So the question is, how is that going to be actualized, if at all? We've sort of been reduced to sort of reading the tweet leaves, and I did an analysis for the panel where I read all of President Trump's 3 a.m. tweets, and can report safely that there were no tweets about the FCPA or other enforcement initiatives. But look, so what's interesting is we're at a very interesting kind of fork in the road, I think, for enforcement on some of these initiatives. On the one hand, if you look at 2016, it was a record year for enforcement. And we've seen that trend sort of steadily, I would say, going back a number of years. But for example, if you look at the FCPA numbers, they were huge, right? In every measurable that you would look at. Huge, as someone might say. You had, $2.5 billion, I think, of fines and penalties. You had 27 individuals charged under just the FCPA, which is more than has ever been before in a single year. I think you had over 53 companies involved in reported settlements. And if you read sort of public filings and things out there, most people think that there may be, somewhere between, 200 companies or so that are now actively being investigated by either Department of Justice or in conjunction with the SEC for various, financial, fraud problems. And so that's all been happening. And the other thing that happened, obviously, last year, which was sort of big news in our world, was the pilot program that was introduced by the Department of Justice. It was introduced in April 2016. It was a 1-year program focused on the FCPA. And what it essentially tried to do is, look, there was been a lot of criticism over the last X number of years, from the business world certainly, that, and as Art was talking about, that the FCPA is prohibitively expensive to comply with, and it's, companies are having to police themselves, and you can have a low-level employee, in a far-flung corner of the world, do something without any supervision, and all of a sudden you're spending millions of dollars, on an investigation and having other costs as well. You're having to make public filings if you're a public company. And so one of the things the pilot program was trying to do was codify incentives for companies to basically reward them for cooperating and really reward them for self-disclosure, as opposed to after the fact, after something, whether it's through a whistleblower action. We've seen a tremendous proliferation, I would say, in the last 5-10 years of whistleblower lawsuits, both under the False Claims Act, that are giving rise to a lot of these investigations. And so one of the things that DOJ has emphasized is if companies step forward voluntarily and are the first reporters of a problem, that's something that can essentially mitigate, in their words, a lot of the compliance penalties that they might introduce. And they've set out guidelines. For example, you can, if you're a company, you might get up to half off, 50% off a fine or penalty that you would have to ordinarily pay if you applied, let's say, the federal sentencing guidelines to your particular case. They're willing to do that. They're also willing to decline and give you a declination where they won't bring charges. And this year, in 2016, I think there were at least 5 public declinations published by the department under this program. And, through public reports, there are probably another 6 or 7 companies that got declinations going through this process. And also, obviously, one of the carrots out there for companies was, and you may not even need to have a monitor, which obviously is a huge expense to companies going forward and doing business. Or you may not have, if you don't have to enter into a corporate integrity agreement. So that program was on the table, and one of the questions after the election in the new year was, what's going to happen? Were they going to renew this program? And last month, the department did renew the program. And so we know that the program is going forward. And the other thing that we've seen, and so that's one tea leaf. The other thing that happened, though, and look, and this is Art and Jack have referenced this, is that in government, right, you have the sort of political appointees that come in to run agencies, and then you have the career people who are there through various administrations who are doing the work. And as we know, most of these investigations, these don't open and shut over a few months. These are multi-year, complicated cases that the people have often been are working on. But the new head of the SEC that President Trump appointed, Jay Clayton, was very different than Mary Jo White. They both came from sort of Wall Street law firms. But whereas Mary Jo White was a former U.S. attorney, she had an enforcement background. She was a litigator. She's sort of known as a no-nonsense, person who leader of the SEC who emphasized increasing the SEC's role in enforcement. We've seen the SEC take a much larger role in FCPA cases, for example, than they ever did. And now Jay Clayton is the opposite, right? He's a corporate transactional lawyer, a mergers and acquisitions person. And he was actually on a committee in 2011 that wrote a paper that essentially said that the FCPA put businesses at a competitive disadvantage. And it opined and speculated about some things that could be done, for example, to reduce the enforcement effect of the FCPA on business. And so now you have someone like that leading the SEC. And of course, look, there are ways, there's going to be a tension, right? Because at the same time, last year the department announced, when they were talking about this pilot program, that they had, for example, more than doubled the number of prosecutors that were devoted to FCPA. We know they formed the kleptocracy group, which is very active and is bringing a number of cases. And they also, they doubled the number of federal agents that were devoted exclusively now to these sort of corruption in financial investigations. And so, look, we know in the enforcement world, right, it's the old Watergate saying, right? You follow the money in terms of figuring out what is the government going to do in the enforcement world. When you have all these resources that are devoted to something, it starts to run, right? And at a certain point, it almost runs a little bit on autopilot, and these cases proliferate, and investigations lead to other investigations. And so one of the tensions is going to be, what can these political appointees do coming in to shift things or to downplay or de-emphasize some of these large programs? And look, there are things that can be done. For example, there could be legislative amendments that are offered to the FCPA. So, for example, under the UK Bribery Act, there is a defense in the law for good faith compliance, adequate measures. People have been talking about, amending the FCPA in Congress to add that kind of a defense. And so, look, if something like that were to pass, and who knows if we can pass any law, I guess we're going to not shut down the government, supposedly. I read that this morning, or heard it this morning on the news. But, assuming you can pass a law, that's something that could chip away, because then you're creating and you're sort of going along with this idea of compliance. And you could move to more of a disclosure and compliance regime with businesses. The other thing you can do, and this is something that, Mr. Clayton suggested in his committee suggested in the paper, is you can focus more on individuals. And so you can punish individuals at companies and sort of take a more hands-off approach to the companies themselves, which would obviously be more business friendly. We had the Yates memo that came out, I guess now a little more than a year ago, right, where the department kind of emphasized this idea, where it was getting a lot of criticism after the financial crisis for the fact that you didn't have individuals prosecuted, you had a lot of companies settling and making deals, and no one was going to jail. And so the memo, for most people who do this every day, the memo is really a compilation of things that the department has always said, frankly, in terms of individuals and the factors you use. But you certainly see more of an uptick in investigations when you're dealing with the government, where they are focused more on individuals at companies. And certainly you could see, whether it's, in the tax world or in the FCPA world, you could see a bit of a shift where they could start to focus more on the, quote, individual wrongdoers and, sort of allow companies more of a compliance path going forward, which, would have some advantages for them. I don't know how that would be, viewed by sort of the rank and file at the department. We started off the year with Odebrecht, right? A huge, financial number of settlement, 3.5 billion. And that is obviously a multinational engineering firm that worked with tentacles in various countries, Brazil, obviously, Panama, and other places. And so, those cases are very active. The Panama Papers got leaked, so we can all read WikiLeaks to figure out things and try to read more tea leaves. But these are certainly big investigations that are certainly very active right now and ongoing. There don't seem to be any signs that they're going to abate. And so I think we're going to see a continuation of these enforcement trends. They may be softened perhaps at the margins. We might see more of a focus on individuals. But there's been when you have this many resources devoted to areas, unless you have, some very strong legislative action, and I'll defer to Jack on the likelihood of something changing there, I think we can, expect probably more of the same relative, because these are things that have been put in place, going back now several years.
One follow-up, the issue with the common reporting system is what you're going to see from the new administration is you're going to see the intergovernment communication going back to what they refer to as a on-request system. And it's a system that's been in place for pretty much most of our lives. It's where instead of having a automatic exchange of information with the CRS or with FATCA or any other treaty that's out there, what you're going to find is it goes back to the old system, which is I need something from you, I send you requests. You get the request, you look at it. You decide if you want to fill it. If you don't want to fill it, you come up with some lame excuse why you want to delay it, usually because somebody's related to somebody and you know somebody in the government. But generally, the old system was like that. So I send it to you, and then you decide what you want to do with it. And that's the system that has been in place and that will remain in place. Doesn't mean that the government's not going to comply with the requests, but it's very similar to what happened in the previous years. We're going to go back to an on-request system. This notion that there's going to be an automatic exchange of information, that the U.S. is going to put all of our accounts online for everybody else to look at it at will, is not going to happen. The fact that China is going to put all their accounts online so we can look at their accounts at will, not going to happen. Maybe the EU wants that to happen, but that's pretty much a dream. To think that I'm going to be able to get online as an agent or a legislator and say, oh, what is that person doing in Shanghai? That the Chinese government is really going to allow that. So we need to get that system out of the automatic exchange. What we really need to do is have intergovernment agreements on more important things like major crimes, human trafficking, terrorism, major financial crimes. I believe if you go to a more moderate position, you'll find that you'll get a lot of cooperation from the governments on the prostitution, the kid trafficking, the things that are really everybody can agree on. And then the things that you don't agree on, those are going to be the ones you put in for a request, and 2 years later they'll answer it, which is very common in foreign governments. Something else that needs to be said on the new administration, they're coming in at a time when Brexit is in the middle of their negotiations. So they started their process. They have just under 2 years to decide what they want to do with that. But I believe that the Brexit is going to create a cycle that is then going to flow back to the United States. And the fact of the matter is, the position that the EU is taking with the United Kingdom, it's really not negotiable, unless they're doing like President Trump and coming out with a strong position that later is going to be modified. But the stuff that they're telling the United Kingdom right now about Gibraltar and free access of personnel and treating everybody the same is not going to work. So unless that's a bargaining position, it's going to end up being a really hard Brexit. Maybe not a full hard Brexit, but it's going to be they're going to put the United Kingdom in a place that they can't get out of. And if you missed it, about 6 months ago, the Interior Secretary in the United Kingdom said that if the EU made it difficult for us, and made it difficult in the financial sector especially, since that's where they get the majority of their funds, that the United Kingdom would become an offshore center again. Now, we all know that they're an offshore center right now, but and so are we. So let's be fair about that. But the fact of the matter is, if the EU is really going to push hard on London and try and take away their jobs, which we know Frankfurt wants their jobs, Paris wants their jobs, some of the Eastern Bloc countries are more than willing to step up. There's been a couple companies that said they're going to expand in the Eastern Bloc countries, their banking divisions. But if you really think that they're going to be harsh on the UK and that they're not going to come back and say, no problem, we'll take care of this. We've been a financial center for several hundred years. We'll just make it easier for the money to come in. And I think that's going to create a cycle where that flows back to the United States, and we end up doing the same thing, which we are now. We're a very comfortable offshore center. There's several states you can go to, and you can move your money here quite easily. If not, you can go to certain parts of Miami and see all the foreigners, billionaires that are here with their money safely in bank accounts. So I think it's going to be a chain reaction. It's going to start with the EU's position. It's going to flow into the UK, and then eventually it's going to flow back into the United States, where I think next year, 2 years from now, you're going to find out that London and Miami and New York are going to be the offshore financial centers.
I think they are right now. I agree with you, and that's been clear for a long time. I'd like to go back to what you were saying about FATCA. I don't think that that's been terribly relevant to the discussion of where IRS enforcement is, or for that matter, where it's going in the future, because that's really aimed at offshore bank operations, forcing banks to give up information about American citizens. Essentially, from the beginning, it's been unenforceable, and the only way we've been able to get at foreign institutions that have been helping Americans evade tax is when that information has come public in other ways. So, for example, Panama Papers opens a door and window to everything that's been going on and who's been doing it and how. But FATCA repealing won't make a large difference. What is happening, and this is very significant, is the river of information that has been generated by the people who've come in voluntarily to say, wait a minute, I had an offshore account, I want to get right with the service, here's my information, and by the way, I'm available to tell you everything I know about who organized this, and who else is involved and how they're involved. And there's enough information to keep IRS civil going for the next half century. And I think it's also a mistake to look at the criminal statistics and say that that really reflects IRS enforcement, because most enforcement is, we need the money. Going to jail is one thing, but really collecting the money is where we are. And that's what is going to happen, the continuing effort to collect the money from people who've hidden the money offshore. And what goes along with that is going to be IRS having the advantage of having people who've thought about going offshore, at least Americans, being scared out of their minds. So they'll say, wait a minute, look at all these other people who are rich, and now they're not so rich, and they've been embarrassed and outed, and we are not going to put our money there because we don't trust that it'll be safe, secure, and confidential. A couple of words about the SEC. The SEC has a whistleblower program, which is one of the most effective of all the whistleblower programs in government. And there, the SEC pays people up front, unlike IRS, which makes you wait somewhere between 6 and 20 years to get your reward. And again, different from IRS is the business of protecting the whistleblower actively. So if you're an IRS whistleblower, you're in a bunch of trouble because there's no protection for you, and you can lose your job, you can be put through all kinds of trouble, but nobody's going to really do much about it. In the case of the SEC, they'll come in, go to court, and actively protect you, get you reinstated, get you back pay, and that's been very, very effective. The Kleptocracy Initiative and the question of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigations is very important. And the guy who deserves a lot of credit, the president who deserves a lot of credit for working in this area, is George W. Bush. And he got to that place because he started looking at Afghanistan and Iraq and said, wait a minute, we keep throwing money into these places and we're not getting anything for it, and the money's disappearing. And that has been an ongoing problem. Well, from a U.S. perspective, if you look at the fact that we're beginning to ramp up once again to continue the war in Afghanistan, you look at what has been put into Afghanistan and how much has been stolen, any president who looks at that and in his right mind is going to go after that stolen money and want the world to cooperate in finding it. The amounts are staggering. We put in 3 times the GDP of Afghanistan every year since this bloody war started, and there's nothing to show for it. The Inspector General, who's supposed to look at all of this, Sopko, who I've known for years, has come up with one report after another of disappeared cash, projects started and never finished, Afghans going from the airport in Kabul to the Gulf with suitcases full of currency. It's just not going to happen that we're going to walk away from that kind of corruption and not ask questions. Now, the one other thing, which I don't know what the outcome will be, but we've been looking at gigantic money laundering going on by all kinds of people through real estate here in the U.S. And as you may know, there's been a temporary program to force identification of anonymous offshore entities buying real estate. In other words, whose behind it, whose money is it? I think that that's going to continue, even though it might not be totally favored, simply because so much of that money is coming from very politically sensitive places, and a lot of this is going to be forced, I would predict, into the open as this Russia discussion regarding Trump and the Trump family goes forward. Because so much money has come in from Russia, as well as Latin America, in the form of purchasing real estate for cash through an offshore corporation, and then either flipping it or mortgaging it out. And we'll talk more about this as a session on Russia and where we are and the investigations that are going forward, but I think the government will continue to insist that offshore corporations identify the source of the money going into major real estate projects. And right here in Miami, you look up and down the beach, you look at Liberty City, an area where you could have never thought would become a big residential area in Miami. All of a sudden, huge blocks of apartment buildings, not clear who's going to live in them, but my guess is the builders don't much care. So that's Miami for you.
Well, as a resident of South Florida, I'm hoping the FinCEN program won't destroy the South Florida economy. It's sort of an old joke that most of a lot of the economy down here is based on foreign investment of murky background, which is, so South Florida is sort of already an offshore haven, I guess, to Art and Jack's point. I think one thing I have just to dovetail on a couple of the comments, I want to maybe get Art to talk a little bit about what he thinks is going to happen with cross-border cooperation, because in the old days, there really, before like the UBS days, obviously, there wasn't really any kind of meaningful cooperation, right? And we have FATCA that obviously requires some reporting, although Jack points out it's difficult to force it in terms of banks and institutions. But we've had all of these voluntary disclosure programs for the individuals with various countries. Switzerland and Israel come to mind. And those programs have, as Jack was pointing out, have generated a lot of information which not only led to civil recoveries, but have led to a number of the large corporate investigation cases. We obviously saw sort of the those Swiss cases, and those cases are sort of ending effectively. But a lot of that information came from individual disclosure, and then obviously we had cases involving Israel, and a lot of the large banks in Israel were all in the same position as the Swiss banks. And one of the questions I think going forward, right, is whether this will continue with some of the other offshore havens that you hear about. Obviously Panama is on, people talk about the Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands, we could go on, Liechtenstein. And what the administration obviously can do in terms of setting these programs and priorities is they can end these programs. And then, there's been a lot of data mining from all of these, both from statutes like FATCA and also from the disclosure programs, which the department has used to generate these corporate investigations, which is true. They don't typically, there have been some individual prosecutions, but by and large, they're resulting in recovering money through fines and penalties with companies that go through sort of like an FCPA type process. We've seen that the last, X number of years. But I guess the question for Art I would ask is, do you think the sort of interagency cooperation that's been developed, let's say since the UBS case, do you see that continuing going forward, in a serious way, or do you see that?
Well, I believe that again, going back to large crimes, I think all the countries can agree on the big stuff. We've been focusing too long on some of the smaller stuff and not focusing on the big items. If you get the countries cooperating on the kidnapping cases, the murder, the terrorism, things that they can agree on, the human trafficking, the ones that are really, that they can be effective with cross-border cooperation, you might see some additional benefits on the public corruption side. Now, how much is it the responsibility of the home country to police other countries' citizens? I mean, really, there's a limit in that. So here we are in Miami. There was always a joke in the 70s that even during the oil embargo, there were 30 cranes on Brickell Avenue building buildings. Now, if you're from Miami, you say, hey, that's great. We got new buildings going up. They pay taxes, real estate taxes, and sales tax, and everybody's happy here. How much is it our responsibility, or how much is it the Caymans or the Bahamas or any other country's responsibility to police other people's citizens? So someone comes here, they bring in money from their bank. We might ask the foreign government, hey, where's this money from? If the foreign bank gives us a proper answer, the money comes in. They buy their condominiums, they purchase the things they like, and they live here. As long as they're following our rules, and as long as the fact is that the country that's sending the money doesn't have an issue with it, those transactions are going to keep taking place. So how much can we do in any country if you make a request back to the sender country and they give you a positive statement? If you receive money in a wire transfer and you make an inquiry, or the bank makes a KYC inquiry and they get the documents they need, what is that bank supposed to do? What is that country supposed to do? Turn down all that business and then become a less profitable country? Or they're going to do like most countries. They're going to take the money after they do their basic KYC, as long as they're doing it properly and they are honest about their work. But the reality is every country is going to look out for their sole benefit, because they have to make their economy work. They got to keep people working. Again, going back to where they need to focus on the big stuff and I think we'll keep the corruption down to a minimum. So in the old days, countries cooperated on big items, and they always knew that there was a small piece of what was happening that was going to be public corruption, maybe 2% or 5%. We can't get that at 10%. We can't get that at 15 or 20. So I think that's where we're going to go back to those days where on requests are made. The big stuff will be cooperated on. I think you'll get a lot of cooperation between governments on that. And when things are exposed, you're going to get cooperation. So going back to the UBS case, when things are thrown out in the open, somebody produces a disk and there's 10,000 names out there, it's going to be dealt with because the countries can't hide it. If they can hide it, that's a different issue. You're not going to see it.
Just to remind everybody, much of the information that was generated was done through the civil side of IRS through John Doe summonses. And those John Doe summonses, at least so far, haven't stopped. So I see a lot of stuff continuing, and I think collecting the money is going to be the priority. So if you're looking for big cases, the place to go is offshore, and the use of John Doe summonses will get you quite a bit of information. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And on the subject of corruption worldwide, that's an issue we can't really walk away from. Even though we've listened to a campaign talking about America first, it turns out that what's in America's interest is having functional governments that are reasonably representative of their people around the world. And I give you, as a case in point, the situation in Africa, where poverty, famine, all sorts of economic problems coming as a result of corruption have fostered terrorism and trafficking and children as soldiers and all of these other things that the entire globe says are pretty detestable and things we don't want. So it's very hard to walk away from cases like Angola or Equatorial Guinea. Angola is one of the most horrible examples of corruption on the planet, where there are people who are living, most of the population living on $1 a day or less, where the country, which is per capita up among the 10 highest per capita income in the world, but in terms of quality of life analysis, probably around 160th. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about corruption in Angola, you can check hotel rates in Luanda. For a period of time, they were running well ahead of New York, London, and Tokyo. Now that the price of oil has collapsed, they're not quite as high, but let me tell you, the people in that government are living very well. Now, is that a problem for the U.S.? Ultimately, yes. So we're not going to walk away from that, and I think that anybody in the offshore world who caters to these truly high-end crooks is going to have a problem. This is a clientele you don't want to be working with. So, yeah, I think what we ought to do is open the floor, whatever time remaining, to questions from you all.
Thank you. So some of the biggest FCPA fines and investigations have been against foreign companies, and the original intent of the FCPA was to improve American competitiveness abroad within corrupt nations to compete against foreign companies. Do you see any way to recast this, at least in the eyes of the Trump administration's protectionism, to recast the FCPA as very much a tool for American competitiveness as a way to push back kind of against this intent to restrict it?
I'll start the first answer on that. Originally, when FCPA 40 years ago, when it was enacted, it was really a strictly SEC and a bribery legislation. That was back when people were paying car companies and foreign governments large bribes to get the contract. That was the goal. It was never meant for, I don't believe it was never meant for some of the smaller issues. Like, for instance, Walmart got charged in India because their drivers, when they were leaving the customs port, were paying anywhere from $50 to $200 to get their cargo out of the port. To me, I never thought that was the focus. It was more on, hey, I'm bribing a government official to get this contract or buy these airplanes or whatever it was. So, but a side component of that is, yes, there's a lot of pretty smart individuals in the Treasury and financial world that believe that the cleaner we are, even if it's costly to those multinational companies, makes us more competitive, because people look at those companies and say, hey, I want to deal with a clean company. I want to be able to buy and sell my product and not worry about the corruption portion of it.
I think the key thing to look at is the network of treaties and agreements that have come into force regarding the question of corruption. So the FCPA was for a long period of time all out there by itself. Now there's an inter-American anti-corruption treaty, there's a European anti-corruption treaty, there's an international convention on corruption. This issue is now a global issue, and all of the governments, certainly in the developed world, have pledged to do something about corruption. So within the last couple of weeks, the government of Italy, not necessarily known as one of the strongest anti-corruption governments on the planet, went after its largest oil company for shenanigans in Nigeria. So this is really a changed world, and I don't think anybody's going to walk it back. It's not so much a question of anti-competitive at the moment. The real problem is we want to control governments and government officials who are really undermining competition and free markets around the world. Because in the end, when you pay a bribe to get a contract, what you're doing is undercutting your competitors. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, as a defense lawyer, just the first thing to jack is that one man's crook is another man's client. That's the first point. But specifically to your question, I think your focus was, could you use something like the FCPA to target foreign companies more? And the trick of it is obviously jurisdiction, and there have been some aggressive attempts at, some would say, manufacturing jurisdiction, depending on what any sort of nexus to the U.S. When you have a purely foreign business, foreign subsidiary, no incorporation in America. And there have been a couple court cases that have dismissed cases for lack of it. But there are things you could do. Like, for example, the definition of foreign official, you can take a more expansive view of it. Last year there were a number of pharmaceutical cases done in China where they focused on the essentially bribes to physicians, but because the hospitals were, quote, state-owned, they treated it under the FCPA, and there were companies like Glaxo and some others that got hit for huge fines based on that. So you can try to do things like that, where you expand your definitions to allow you, because I don't think it's a lack of effort. It's really more of a legal challenge based, or you could, I guess, amend the FCPA, give it even more teeth. But so that's one area. The other thing that's been done is on the money laundering statute was amended several years ago and has much more theoretical reach than it used to. For example, if you defraud a bank in any way, you could be subject to 1956, which is a U.S. statute. And so, you might be able to get at conduct typically not prosecuted here, extraterritorial conduct, depending on what's happening there. There's also language in that same amendment that relates to if the conduct relates to a fraud in a country that's signatory to a treaty that we are also bound to, that could generate jurisdiction. We haven't seen those cases, but they may be coming, with some of these, based on some of the things some of the recent trends, particularly, with things like, Panama Papers and some other things that have been leaked. There's more of an emphasis on maybe trying to address that.
We have a question here.
Yeah, I'd like to get a little bit more clarity on one comment or statement that was made earlier in the panel, which was, I think, Art's, that was to the effect that repeal or not, that the administration would be likely simply not to enforce FATCA. What are we supposed to draw from that? In other words, if we've got clients who made the mistake in light of that statement, who made the mistake of registering in order to avoid 30% withholding, that they don't need to worry about 30% withholding anymore, they don't have to worry about W-8 bends, or is the scope of that statement or prediction that the Justice Department is not going to follow up using potential prosecutorial information that's been obtained from FATCA? A little clarity there would be helpful.
The FATCA problem is an interesting one because the large banks that do business globally that also have a footprint here in the U.S. are going to comply with it no matter what the enforcement effort is or not, or isn't, because they feel that they have to comply, and if you're a big bank, there's no way to walk away from it. The real compliance problem is for much smaller financial institutions, and there the problem is no matter what agreement or deal is reached with IRS or with the Department of Justice regarding FATCA, the question of, all right, now you've got some sort of effort to go after them, but how the hell are you going to send an auditor in to make sure they're living up to whatever deal you've cut? And when I was talking about the enforceability, that's what I was talking about. Even in the case of the big Swiss banks that signed agreements, settlements with DOJ, the question is who is in charge of making sure they live up to the deferred prosecution? And there, U.S. auditors aren't going to be allowed in to go through the books. It has to be local third-party people who are going to check up on it. And the question of how well they do or whether they do it, that's an open question. So I just think that FATCA as a principal enforcement tool isn't going to do very much, but there's plenty else out there, particularly the statutes regarding promoter and in general helping people to evade U.S. tax, which is a felony. That's what's going to be the real enforcement handle.
Yes, I think I made that comment earlier. I believe that the law is still in place on our side of the House. The legislative portion is still there. So the Treasury Department is going to have to come up with some type of guidance to issue out to the foreign entities. But I believe right now people are going to collect the data, as Jack said. The banks are going to do what they're supposed to do. They're going to send the data to FinCEN in the United States. And from that point on, who knows what's going to happen after that. So your guess is as good as mine.
Oh, okay, we're going to wrap it up. Is there one more question now? Okay, can we give them a round of applause, please, for a very good session?